Hello and welcome. In this video, as we begin to analyze the theme of sacramentality, we'll look at some of the philosophical questions in logic and epistemology that underpin our understanding of semiotics and therefore that are at the basis of our understanding of sacraments as signs. In our last session, as we discussed Christian attitudes towards the environment and our responsibilities towards creation, we highlighted that Christian ecology is not merely a product of jumping on the tree-hugging bandwagon of current politics, but it stems out of a deep consideration that creation, that is nature, is not pura, is not aseptic, meaningless, tabula rasa, but it's intrinsically imbued and therefore it scintillates with the glory of God and with the meaning that God has inscribed in it. We said that this meaning in nature is neither arbitrarily imposed by us or assign it to it at will, nor it is bestowed on it at the incarnation as some sort of extrinsic violence that comes from outside of nature, but it is intrinsic, it's inscribed in the very fabric of space and time at the moment of creation. Christ holds creation in his hands, as we read in the prologue to the Gospel of St. John. Without him, not one thing that was made was made. So Christ holding creation in his hands is both the archetype and the redeemer of the cosmos. And creation's meaning, originally woven into the fabric of the cosmos, is reaffirmed and sanctified and hallowed at the incarnation. Now, human beings who by the fall had lost their capacity to perceive natural signification at the incarnation are restored in their sign-making ability through Christ's salvific grace. Do you remember Hugh of St. Victor's metaphor of the three eyes? We do not see nature's intrinsic mystical character anymore because we've become blind to it, but through Christ's revelation, we are once again able to grasp the meaningful sacramental character of nature, and therefore we are called once again to interact with the book of nature which has meaning in its own right because it's held by Christ, its archetype, and proclaims through the book of grace the same Christ that fulfills it. Okay, but what does it mean? What does it mean to say that nature is meaningful? And we are called to cherish that meaning, interact with it, and recognize and find in it the grace of God and therefore salvation through the revelation of God through it. What do we mean when we as Christians describe creation as a sacramental cosmos? We will endeavor to examine this a bit further through a philosophical analysis of the problem of epistemology in the post-Kantian milieu. So first of all, we need to ask a few philosophical questions. I said philosophical questions because our theological explanations are upheld and underpinned by a number of philosophical assumptions. I'll try to show you how. Let's ask the theological question. What is a sacrament? What do we mean when we say sacrament? Well, the most common definition is one adapted from one of Augustine's writings. It sees the sacrament as a visible sign of an invisible grace, an outward sign of an inward grace. A visible sign of an invisible grace. But then, at this point, what is a sign? You see, the question is no longer theological at this point, the question is philosophical. If we say that a sacrament is a sign, what do we mean when we say sign? What is signification? What does the sign actually signify? What does a sign do? And in what relationship is the sign to its signified reality, to the reality towards which it points? Let me put it in a slightly different way. What is the difference between this and this? What is the difference between a stop sign and the Eucharist? We just said that they are both signs. Are they the same kind of sign? Are they the same thing? Let us challenge some common assumptions. Now, on one hand of the theological spectrum throughout 2,000 years of Christian theology, we have had people saying that sacraments are no more than arbitrary signs. How could we update this? They are no more than a PowerPoint presentation. There is no difference between the Eucharist and a stop sign. The sacraments, in this way, are mere irrationalistic, arbitrary commands. They carry no signification in themselves. Their meaning is superimposed, and that's what they are. They are arbitrary signs. So Jesus asked us to take bread and wine, but he could have equally asked us to use orange juice and a new hairstyle, and that would have been the same. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we have an equally problematic understanding of sacraments. Sacraments are signs, but they are signs where each sign is also the very thing it represents through a complete identification that does not make them that makes them no longer signs. So basically, signs in this case are runes. If you think of medieval runes, the runes themselves are what they represent. So there is no distinction anymore between the sign and its signified reality. At one end of the spectrum, the two things are completely alien and arbitrary. At the opposite end of the spectrum, the two things are the very same thing without distinction. Now, these are philosophical questions. Once again, the theological questions can be answered on the basis of which answers we give to these philosophical questions. Philosophy, the philosophy of semiotics in this case. So fine. The first thing that we need to do is understand the philosophy underpinning the sacramental question. So the first question that we ask, we said, is the question of signs, the question of semiotics. We need to ask ourselves the question, what is a sign? Okay, a sign, by definition, is something that points to something else. But then, as we said, in what relationship are the two tokens? And by that, in semiotics, we mean the signifier and the signified. In the case of a stop sign, in what relationship is the actual octagonal sign to the fact that you need to hit the brakes in your car? One signifies the other. One is the signifier, the other one is the signified. So you can see that in semiotics, you need to build a system of links between these tokens. So how are the two tokens linked? And is that link arbitrary or is it intrinsic? Particularly if we refer to a sacred sign, this question is important. The question is related with, in what relationship is nature and material things with the supernatural and the reality of God? In what relationship is revelation and reason? In what relationship is creation and the cosmos with the grace of God? In summary, once again, we revert to the discussion that we have had during our first session in this course, the question of epistemology. How do we know about God? It's a question of philosophy again. Now, In order to understand the problem of sacramentality, we need to start with post-Kantian epistemology and what we understand now by signification. Okay, let's start with a little bit of Aristotelian logic. Now, Aristotle says that our reasoning is underpinned and upheld by a series of syllogisms. So our sentences make sense because each of them can be broken down into a series of syllogisms. And provided that the syllogisms that we use are right, true, and credible, then our discourse is right, true, and credible, and makes sense. Okay, so Aristotle describes one type of syllogisms, and he calls it the mode of Barbara. And syllogisms go like this. They have two premises and a conclusion. So they have a premissa major, premissa minor, and conclusio at the end. So the major premise is that all men die. Minor premise, now the zoomed in premise, Socrates is a man. Therefore, the conclusion of this syllogism is that Socrates too dies. So you see, you take the universal character, all men die, you apply to the particular, to Socrates, who is one of these men, and therefore Socrates, as one of these men, dies as well because all men dies. Now, there are a number of different syllogisms codified by Boethius in late antiquity, and they correspond to 9 rules. There is no reason to go into all of them, but it's important to say that these types of syllogisms are deductive syllogisms. So, given the broad statement at the beginning, you apply it to a situation, and therefore you get the conclusion. You are operating what in epistemology is called a deduction. These are deductive syllogisms. All men die, Socrates is a man, Socrates dies. Now, there's another kind of syllogism. This one was the favorite syllogism of the empiricists throughout the history of philosophy. And it's the kind of syllogism that you would see used in the empirical sciences. Now, look at the difference between this and the syllogism in the mode of Barbara that we have just analyzed. The syllogism in the mode of Barbara says, all men die, Socrates is a man, Socrates dies. Look at this other kind of syllogism. Bob is a man, John is a man, Peter is a man. Bob, John, and Peter die, therefore all men die. Now, this is the opposite. It's not all men die, Bob, John, and Peter are men, Bob, John, and Peter die. This is a different type of reasoning. This syllogism is called inductive. And as I said, well, the first one is typical of the deductive kind of reasoning, so philosophical reasoning, literary, liberal arts, and so on. This syllogism is the typical syllogism of the empirical science. Think of this. How do you know that the sun will rise tomorrow? Well, you go through one of these inductive syllogisms. The sun rose yesterday, the sun rose today, the sun has risen every day until now, so there's a good probability that the sun will rise tomorrow. Apply to biology. This organism behaves in this way, that other organism behaves in this way. This third organism, who looks similar to these two, will probably also behave in this way. This is the syllogism of empirical sciences. So, let's try to analyze them together. The first kind of syllogism operates what is called an analytical judgment a priori. What does it mean? It means that its judgment is always certain, but never new. Now, all men die. Socrates is a man. Socrates dies is absolutely certain because we know that all men die. If the two premises, the premissa major and the premissa minor, are both true, then the conclusion is necessarily always certain and true. However, the conclusion doesn't include any new information for us, doesn't offer us any new information. We already knew at the beginning, by the major premise, that all men die. The fact that we now know that Socrates dies hasn't offered us any new information on our world, on the fact that on mortality or on anything. The conclusion is already contained in the premissa major, and provided the truth of the premisse, the conclusion is also inescapably always true. The second type of syllogism operates what is called a synthetic judgment a posteriori. Now, this is always new, but it's never certain. You see the opposite. Now, we said the sun rose yesterday, the sun rose today, the sun will probably rise tomorrow. Now, this is a new judgment. It gives me some extra information, but I am not and can never be 100% sure. Perhaps my physics is all wrong and I have missed something, which means that tomorrow the sun will not rise. Same in the biological sciences, for example. This organism behaves in this way, that other organism behaves in this way. This organism looks like this too. Chances are it will behave in the same way, but I don't know. So the conclusion is not contained in the premisse, which means that it will be always new, it will always add new information, but its value is only probable. It's no longer inescapably certain. Okay, so far so. Okay, let's see how Immanuel Kant, offers a review of syllogism reasoning. Now, he has highlighted the strengths and weaknesses of these two types of syllogisms. One is always certain, never new. The other one is always new, never certain. He says it would be amazing if we had not an analytic judgment a priori or a synthetic judgment a posteriori. It would be amazing if we had a synthetic judgment a priori. That would be always new and always certain. The conclusion would not be contained in the premisse, but at the same time, it would be inescapably true. Now, in this way, Kant says, knowledge could move forward. Where could he find this? Where could one find this sort of synthetic judgment a priori? He says, well, you can actually find it in maths. 5 plus 7 equals 12. This is the example that he uses. Now, 12 is not contained in the 5, is not contained in the 7, so it's not contained in any of the two initial premises, but the conclusion, 12, is inescapably true. So he thinks he can find this source of synthetic judgment a priori in mathematics, for example. So what is Kant's conclusion at this point? Well, he says that pure reason is infallible within its own domain. So where did he find this synthetic judgments a priori? He found them in maths. So mathematics is a domain founded by pure reason, therefore pure reason can always be new and certain within maths, but not outside of the parameters of maths. So it cannot be in physics, for example, because it's not founded by pure reason. Everything else which is not founded by our pure reason is learned by entering into contact with it. Now, that doesn't mean physical contact, it means by interaction with it. We learn, we experience it exclusively through the mediation of space and time. And in this case, pure reason is paralyzed. What does he mean by that? Every time that we approach something that is not funded and contained within the parameters of pure reasons, then we need to interact with that. But the only interaction that we know, and that is possible, is through the medium of space and time. Which means that reality as we know is spatialized and temporalized. What does that mean? All our knowledge, and our knowledge of all, is mediated through the categories of space and time, and it presents itself to us as spatialized and temporalized. Now, I'm looking at my desk at this moment. I have some sheets of paper. Behind them, or after, I can see my notebook. Behind, I can see my pen holder, and so on. Now, what I'm describing here is space, but it's also time, because after I see my notes, I also see my diary. And after I see my diary, I see my pen holder, and so on. So space and time are the medium through which I'm actually noticing things on my desk. And he describes the difference between things as we perceive them by entering into contact with them through space and time, and the thing as they are, as phenomenon and noumenon. What these two terms mean. The noumenon is the thing as it is in itself. So as I am looking at my desk, for example, I see my desk as spatialized and temporalized. So I see it through the categories of space and times. What I am perceiving them is the desk through space and time, that is the phenomenon. But the desk as it is in itself, that is not through the categories of space and time, well, I'm just not entering into contact with it. I cannot. All I can do is entering into contact with it through space and time. Therefore, the noumenon as such is always unknowable. It is only knowable in its phenomenon forms, that is, through the categories of space and time. However, Kant says, the fact that I perceive a phenomenon gives me grounds to say there must be a noumenon behind it, even though I cannot make any judgment on it, and I will never be able to experience it. Let's objectify it. I am perceiving my desk in front of me through the categories of space and time, so I'm perceiving the phenomenon of the desk. I know that there must be a noumenon desk. I just can't enter into contact with it. But I know that it must be there and it must be real. Fichte corrects Kant in this sense. Kant is not rigorous enough, he says. Even the ontology of the noumenon is within the psychological phenomenology of the individual. What does that mean? It means that Fichte is saying, in the moment in which I even say the word noumenon, in the moment in which I even imagine it or fathom it, it takes shape in my brain, in my mind, in my imagination, well, it's already phenomenologized. It's already something that I'm entering into contact through phenomenon categories. Kant is not rigorous enough, even when I postulate the fact that behind the phenomenon there must be a noumenon. I'm already giving it a face, therefore I'm already phenomenologizing it, which means that all reality is my imagination, is how I phenomenologize it, and therefore my phenomenologization of reality can never be like yours, and therefore this leads to idealism and solipsism. So, what are the theological consequences of an idealist epistemology? Well, quite a few, I would say. What challenge faces the Church in this context? Who is God? Because you see, God must be noumenon. God, but in the moment in which I even say noumenon, I'm giving him a face. I'm imagining him inside my brain, inside my mind, inside my fantasy. And therefore I'm already phenomenologizing him, and he becomes my own extrapolation. Is God pure noumenon? Can I even say that? And what about sacred signs? Let's bring this back to the question of sacramentality. At this point, what is the signification of signs? And even more importantly, sacred signs. And this is where we take the theological discourse, in this case, to its most extreme consequences, by meeting this handsome gentleman by the name of Emil Durkheim. Now, Durkheim says God is noumenon. Of course he is noumenon because he is pure being. But the noumenon cannot exist as such outside the psyche of the human that is postulating the noumenon. So it cannot exist outside my psyche. Then God is my idealized projection. God is me, just the best part of me. The best part of me, which I project on a canvas, and I call God. Why? Because he's noumenon, and he must be noumenon. But the noumenon is my idealization, therefore God is me. Schleiermacher, the father of Protestant liberalism. God and his truth, therefore, must be my experience of him. The result is a subjectivization of the divine. Because you see, if post-Kantian epistemology is right, then our understanding of God can only be our experience of the noumenon, which is only phenomenologized within our psyche. Therefore, God is whatever I make of him, is my experience of him. What does that mean? Well, I wonder if you've ever seen the film The Gods Must Be Crazy, a 1980s film, very dated now if you were to watch it. But it is based on one of these premises. There is a Coke bottle falling into a village in Africa that had never been contacted by Westerners. The Coke bottle falls from an airplane. And once the indigenous population sees this bottle, they've never seen anything like that before, they have no idea what it is for. So they find 101 different uses for that. Perhaps the Coke bottle is an instrument. Perhaps the Coke bottle is something that is necessary to produce beautiful artwork on skins. Perhaps the Coke bottle is a weapon. You know, if God is my own interpretation, the sign is whatever I want it to make. If noumenon is experienced within, is phenomenologized within my psyche in a solipsistic system, then what is the relationship between sign and signified reality? Whatever I want. I am the arbiter of that. So if I decide that the Coke bottle is not to hold Coke, but it's to juggle with, then that's the function of the Coke bottle. Why? Because God is whatever I make of him. My experience of him is what determines what God is. And we find it in so many of our songs, terrible theology that we proclaim to one another when we sing on Sunday morning. He lives, Christ Jesus lives today. If you sing the refrain, you know, a rousing song for Easter morning, you ask me how I know he lives within my heart. The proof of the resurrection has nothing intrinsic, has nothing historical, has nothing of any objective universal value. The fact I know he lives because he lives within me. It's my experience of him that guarantees the truth of the resurrection. God is my own projection. Now, we are talking about a theology based on experience here. If theology, as we said at the beginning of our course, is based on experience rather than on revelation, then the divine becomes subjectivized. Why do I know God loves me? Because I go goosebumpy at an altar call. There's nothing objective there. There's no reference to the incarnate. The fact that God has pitched his tent and tabernacled with us and became one of us has no meaning, has no relevance. I know that God loves me because he makes me go goosebumpy. My experience, however, is not and can never be yours because of the mediation of space and time, because the phenomenon that I perceive is not the phenomenon that you perceive. If you were to look at my desk, if you were to sit in front of me in this moment and you were to look at my desk, you wouldn't see my notes, then my diary, then my pen holder. You would see the opposite. You would see the pen holder, then my diary, then my notes, then me behind it. So you see, your phenomenologization is completely different to mine. It can never be mine. And in fact, even by discussing it with yours, I am phenomenologizing yours when I am not perceiving it like you. So God is my personal interpretation. I imagine God, and that's what God is. That's, as I said, the stance of modern liberalism. But if they are right, bringing it back to the sacramental discourse, the discourse of semiotics, nature and supernature are united by experience. So the sacramental sign, in this case, has a meaning because it creates something that makes me reflect and go transcendental about it. So it's my experience of the divine that informs the transcendental supernatural. So there is no objectivity behind divine signs. There is the fact that I am arbitrarily imposing on them a value because God is my own experience and my own extrapolation, and therefore I associate arbitrarily a sign to a signified reality out voluntaristic, so out of will. There is nothing intrinsically true there. It's just my experience that drives all of this. Divine revelation is to be grounded on the subject's experience of the divine and not on any propositional truths. Do you remember when we talked about the Trinity? Schleiermacher, the father of modern Protestant liberalism, said that it was irrelevant. It needed to be dispensed with, if not made practical in any way, because God is my experience. There is no need to talk about incarnation. The encounter with God, between God and human being, is my heart, is my solipsistic, idealist interaction with the phenomenon through which I postulate the noumenon. So it's all within me, it's all within my heart. There is no need of an objective incarnation. So doctrinal developments are based on revelatory experiences which have been ongoing throughout history. God has a message for me. God told me that such and such. Or God has revealed to me, you know, that and our churches are full of this bad theology. So, bringing it back to structuralism and semiotics. As a consequence of post-Kantian general epistemology, we have the development of grammar structures in Roland Barthes, and most of all, in Michel Foucault, we have a description of history as a succession of episteme. Now, why? Because to him, an episteme is a historical unit which is concentrated within itself, whose signification is within itself, and that bears no relevance, no relation, and no link to anything outside of itself. So, why do we today have, I don't know, let's think of politics, a parliamentary system of politics in the West? Well, because these are the rules that this society has given to itself. They draw on nothing past, and they will influence nothing in the future. These rules are only within this bubble of the here and now. Why? Because they are phenomenologized through our own experience of them. There is no intrinsic continuity, which means that whatever happened in the Middle Ages, first of all, I don't even know because it's outside my phenomenological bubble. So even when I postulate it, I will invent it. And also, whatever happened there bears no consequence to whatever is happening now, and therefore there is nothing I can learn from it. There is no understanding of historical continuity. Bring it back to theology. Therefore, there is no reason why Christians should talk about a historical incarnation, because the encounter between God and man does not happen at the incarnation, it must happen within my heart. So God pitching his tent amongst us bears no relevance to what I make of him. By the way, Foucault's understanding of history nowadays is at the basis of the way that we teach history in schools. We don't teach history in a Christian way, thinking that the cosmos has a direction and it's running towards the salvation of all, the parousia. But it's a series of epistemes. So if you go in any of our classes will study the Romans for 2 weeks, and then they will study the Victorians for 2 weeks, and then they will study medieval knights for 2 weeks. Why? Because these things don't bear any relation to one another, so there is no reason to study them chronologically. But if this is the way that tokens are linked, what does it make of signification? If post-Kantian epistemology is right, then everything around me is my own projection and carries my own individualistic meaning. There is no universal signification, and universal signification is actually not even possible. Signification between tokens must be within the rules of the phenomenological bubble, so whatever I or society make of it. And salvation must be the encounter of God in my phenomenological solipsism. So it's my own experience and in the end, my own effort. Now, if the Book of Grace is arbitrary, what are the obvious consequences for a doctrine of the Book of Nature? If God is my own voice, and the only way that I can know about God is through my solipsistic experience, what does that mean in terms of sacramental theology? Because sacraments are outward signs, things that I come into contact with. What do they mean? Because you see, in this post-Kantian system of epistemology, they mean whatever I make them to mean, because God's my own voice. Therefore, I'm imposing meaning on them, and there is nothing at all universal or intrinsic about them. And the Book of Nature does not scintillate with God's grace. The meaning of the Book of Nature is whatever I want it to mean. God has not inscribed anything in the Book of Nature. For all I care, creation can go down the drains. Let's exploit everything, destroy the planet, because creation is meaningless. The only meaning is the imposition of my meaning on the tokens. So the link between signifier and signified becomes arbitrary. Now, this is the situation in post-Kantian epistemology and semiotics. Now, go back to your Moodle page and complete your worksheet activity and try to make sense of the various strands of the philosophical question underpinning semiotics so far and how this relates to sacramentality. And then follow the rest of the Moodle page and the requirements for next week.